Hey, Jared.
Hey, Abigail.
How you doing?
Well, all things considered, doing quite well.
Fair enough, fair enough. As you know, we're not going to be having an actual ride this year. We'll be doing a virtual ride. So I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you, since you've already been on the ride 6 times, this would have been your seventh year. You've been our tour guide for all those years. Would you be willing to virtually guide on the virtual ride this year?
I'd be thrilled.
So what have you done so far on the ride?
Well, when I was first hired to join the Israel Ride as a guide, I was asked to work with the Chalutzim group. They were increasing in number and they were going ever so fast and so far, and needed perhaps some accompaniment of their own as they explored slightly different areas of the country along the ride as the other groups. And so I was with them for, I think, about 4 or 5 years. While I am an avid biker and absolutely loved the challenge of riding with the Chalutzim, I spent a good part of the riding staring at everyone's rear end. Although I loved the fact that we would be able to explore different elements of the country from the other groups, simply because they were covering more ground.
Mm-hmm.
And then a couple of years ago, I had the blessing of inviting or welcoming really my son, who was celebrating his bar mitzvah, to join us on the ride. And because it was his first ever experience doing something of this nature, we decided to start very easy and very reasonably. And so I switched over to the Shomrim.
Yeah.
And he was able to join me. We were able to spend each day together. And I, instead of guiding the Chalutzim, guided the Shomrim. Happened to really enjoy working with the Shomrim. Perhaps not quite the same challenge physically in terms of the bike ride.
Of course.
But quite nicely every afternoon got to really dig in deep to Israel and history and various sites and cultures, as we ride only in the mornings, and had an opportunity to really explore Israel in the afternoons.
Okay, great. So this is going to be something different for you. This is going to be guiding on a computer screen.
Yes, something that I am not thrilled about and don't have a lot of experience with, given the
Next
nature,
year, back on the ride.
right? Given
Yeah.
the nature of life during these last 7 months, a lot of things have moved virtual. Most of the teaching work that I do, usually in person, has now been virtual as well. So I'm slowly getting used to this educational approach, although I am still definitely not a fan.
Fair enough. I totally understand that. Yes. Great. So I'm really happy you're willing to do this. Since you live in Jerusalem, you can take over the first day of the ride, where we ride on the years that we do ride from Jerusalem towards the coast, towards Ashkelon. So you could guide around those areas. And then Bill could take over, since he lives in the south, he could take over towards the end of the ride. That was what I was thinking. What type of sites do you think you could guide on these days?
Well, first of all, the plan sounds fantastic. It makes perfect sense. Bill and I like to complement each other in many various ways, even including the amount of hair on our heads. Since I live in Jerusalem, and I've been here for all of the 25 years that I've lived in Israel, we'll start with perhaps a view of what many of the riders are able to experience on the pre-ride tours, when we are getting settled into Jerusalem and working on assembling and receiving our bikes. We always offer some morning tours to be able to go and explore different aspects of the city of Jerusalem, some more historical, some more modern, some in the old city, some outside. So I thought maybe we'd start with a nice overlook, a beautiful panorama of the old city of Jerusalem, something that probably a lot of riders are very, very familiar with, whether they've been there on their own or they've been there as part of a ride experience.
Mm-hmm.
Just a nice way to introduce the visuals of the ride as we get started from Jerusalem. And then as we leave the city, usually, traditionally, the last number of years, we make our way over and down the Jerusalem mountainside into the foothills on our way to the coastal plain towards Ashkelon. But along the way, we would stop in the middle ground, known as the Shfela, or the foothills, and there visit one of the sites that has become very, very popular amongst the Shomrim in particular, where we've often had the opportunity to do an afternoon tour exploring the archaeological site of Maresha, which is
beautiful.
Today largely an underground experience, given the caves that were dug 2,000 years ago. And so we'll have an opportunity maybe to explore a little bit of that fascinating story, the meeting point between the hill people and the coastal people, the Israelites and the other Canaanite folks.
Wonderful.
We'll have a site like that. And then, given that certainly for the first night of the ride, we often stay right on the Mediterranean coast, I thought it would be nice just to have that visual because it's so beautiful and so inspiring, especially after a long day of riding literally across the country from Jerusalem to the Mediterranean. Instead of maybe doing a stop in Ashkelon, I thought maybe we'd pop a little bit further to the north and visit the old city of Jaffa.
Right.
And not just the relevant history as one of the most ancient cities in this land and one of the most ancient cities in the world, but also very specifically because it is the gateway, you could say, to the land of Israel, certainly going back into the historical period when we look at, say, the early Zionist narrative, and many of the Jews who were coming from Europe would land by boat at the Jaffa port and start to basically figure out what their land of Israel life was going to look like from that point. So maybe we'll do a little wandering in the alleys of the old city and explore some of those stories as it builds toward the story of modern Tel Aviv.
Great. So something that the riders don't actually see on the ride. That's really, really good.
Yeah, we don't usually make it that far north on the coastal plain. So it's a story that many folks know well, but maybe a site that not everyone has seen, certainly not as part of the Israel Ride experience.
Amazing. So thank you very, very much for being willing to do this. And we'll see you physically on the 2021 ride.
I very much look forward to it.
Great. Bye, Jared.
All right, see you out there. Bye.
All right, everybody, welcome to the 2018 Israel Ride.
Hi, Israel Ride. Welcome to Jerusalem. My name is Jared Goldfarb. I live here in the city. Welcome to my backyard. This is my 6th or 7th year guiding and teaching on the Israel Ride. And I wanted to share a little bit of this beautiful view with you, the riders of the Israel Ride, as this is where we traditionally begin our ride. Although the various groups of the Israel Ride don't necessarily start at this particular overlook. We often spend our first day together as we're preparing for our adventure, touring the old city of Jerusalem to get to know our spiritual home. And so here we have a gorgeous overlook of the old city of Jerusalem, nestled in the Holy Basin. You can see this lovely kind of bowl surrounded by the mountains of Jerusalem. We have the Mount of Olives to the east on the right-hand side. We have the new modern city, West Jerusalem, on the left side, and nestled in the middle, we have the ancient city of Jerusalem, where at least 3 of the major monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all consider to be their spiritual home, which is marked by the Golden Dome right in the center of the walled city, where we refer to it as the Holy Mountain, the Sacred Precinct, the Foundation Stone. There are so many stories that all bring us to this place to feel at home. A certain spiritual home, a historical home, whether we're talking about Abraham journeying into the land of Canaan and coming to meet the Holy Blessed One, the Creator, in order to form this monotheistic bond. It could be Jesus, who comes as a pilgrim to Jerusalem in order to make sacrifice and teach in the temple precincts. It could be Muhammad, who comes from the Arabian Peninsula on the night journey in order to as well convene with the Holy One and confirm the traditions of the third revelation of monotheism. As we ride out of Jerusalem and make our way towards the coastal plain, we come off of the mountain ridge that is Jerusalem, the spine of the land of Israel, and we start to descend down towards sea level. And as we make our way from the east to the west, we find ourselves now in this mid-country, the halfway point between the mountains and the sea. And if we go back into our ancient history, we recognize that throughout all of the various historical periods, the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, was often divided between those who lived in the high hills and those who lived along the seacoast. And so when we make our way into this middle ground, we often find not just stories, but also archaeological remnants of the conflicts that would brew in between these various civilizations. So if we were to now turn to our biblical texts, we would find mentions of a valley named Elah, and that is the valley that we are looking down into as we stand here on top of Tel Azekah. And Valley of Elah is the setting for probably one of the more famous battles, confrontations that takes place in the biblical text between the Israelites who have settled in the early period following the Exodus from Egypt, coming into the Promised Land, coming from the east and settling up onto the mountain ridges, taking into consideration, of course, that the land of Canaan was very heavily settled by many of the Canaanite tribes. In this particular area, we encounter the Philistines, a sea people who had settled along the coastal plain just to our west. And so here we are in a valley where east meets west, hill country meets coastal people, and Israelites encounter Philistines. And so this is the setting where we often tell the story of David and Goliath, the representatives of their cultures, their civilizations, their faiths, who come out from the camps of their people in order to struggle with each other and determine who will be the victor, who will be the dominant force in this land, not just in terms of who controls the pathways and the agriculture, but really who is going to tell the story of this land. And of course, the somewhat unexpected, perhaps, victory of little David over great Goliath is going to set the stage for the unification and the strengthening of the Israelite kingdom as the newcomers settling down in the land of Canaan. As we look towards the west, towards the Mediterranean coastal plain, we can actually just see the coastal cities of Ashdod and Ashkelon, which tend to be our home after the first day of riding on the Israel ride. But they are also two of the 5 Philistine cities that are mentioned in the biblical texts, home to the Philistine people that have come inland in order to challenge the Israelites coming down from the hill country. Those of you who may have participated in the ride with the Shomrim group in the past might recognize this particular spot. Others who may have joined us for one of our afternoon tours, we are now in the area of Tel Maresha, one of the highlights of the afternoon touring experiences on the ride. A fantastic, fantastic site where there are many, many thousands of caves buried deep into the ground that are easily explored thanks to the archaeological process. And as we can see, looking out around us, we are still in the middle ground between the higher hill country outside of Jerusalem and to our west, the coastal plain. And it's here in that middle ground that we often see the interaction of various civilizations, the different cultures representing the various geographic regions, and of course, perhaps most importantly, representing all of the different narratives and stories that have filtered down to us through our biblical texts and other historical texts. Here at Maresha, exploring the site, generally speaking, we are encountering a civilization that we are less familiar with, not one of the main populations whose story gets told about the land of Israel. However, one that was extremely successful, left behind a world of archaeology to explore, and one that definitely had a very active relationship with the Judean population, the Jewish population of about 2,000 years ago. The Edomites, who had settled here in Maresha, taking advantage of their location on one of the major transportation routes connecting the coastal plain to the mountain ridges around Jerusalem, would use their local resources in order to sustain the community, and taking advantage of the simple rock upon which they had built their city, recognized that inside the earth, after digging through this relatively soft chalk rock, they could carve out enormous rooms, caves, halls, and create industry that would not only benefit from the cool weather under the ground, out away from the hot sun, but could also then integrate some of the natural environment around them, like, for example, the birds that were common in this neighborhood. And so we are standing here in a columbarium, from the Latin columbo, meaning dove or pigeon. And this essentially is a dovecote, a place to raise pigeons commercially speaking, and use them either for food, perhaps for fertilizer, maybe even for messages. And of course, given the land that we're in, the history of this land, the cultures and civilizations that dwelt here, these are largely stories about religion, God, and sacrifice. So the pigeon essentially becomes the cheapest, most attainable sacrifice that one could offer. And so raising pigeons and doves in large quantities becomes a very important economic boon for the city of Maresha, situated here on the main highway to Jerusalem. We are now standing underground in one of the roughly 5,000 caves here in the city of Maresha, a city that is mentioned in the biblical texts, but the archaeological site largely reflects the culture and civilization of the Edomite or Idumean people that settled here in the 5th, 4th, up until the 2nd century BCE, before the zero. And this is a community that moved into the region largely from the southern deserts. The name Edomite reflects their origin in the mountains of Edom, not far from Kibbutz Keturah, where we spend a night on the ride every year. And just as we would have seen as we ride from Jerusalem off the mountains towards the coastal plain into this very lush region halfway between the hills and the sea, the Edomites also recognized that this region perhaps had a lot to offer them as a desert culture, and so they moved north, probably following the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE, and settled down in this region, taking advantage of the landscape, the agriculture, the wildlife, and of course the fact that we are on a major transportation route connecting the port of Gaza to the city of Jerusalem. And so as they built up their community, as the community expanded, they also took notice that the rocks were soft enough that it was easy to be able to carve out these huge underground cisterns, one of which you can see here, and essentially create their industrial complexes underground, where it was out of the harsh sun during the day, maintaining a very cool and comfortable temperature throughout the day. And so we find through these thousands of interconnected caves underground here at Maresha, we find water cisterns, we find columbaria or dovecotes, huge halls that may have been used as hosting facilities or production facilities. And of course, perhaps one of the most important industries, and one that is deeply connected to our biblical tradition, and that is the olive press. The olive being one of the 7 species of the land of Israel, one of the most ubiquitous of all produce. We use it in religious ritual, we use it for cooking, we use it for perfume, for hygiene. And so we see here what is called a Beit Bad, a house of the log, and this reflects the most modern technology of the time in commercializing the olive harvest. Around the fall, Sukkot, October, all of the olive trees would ripen, ready for picking. All of the communities would go out, gather the olives, and bring them as quickly as possible in order to achieve the freshest oil to the olive press. The first stage would be to dump them in the crushing pit, where a heavy stone would sort of revolve around a log and crush the olives, including the pits, at which point all of that olive mush would be placed in baskets, often woven with the fibers of the date palm tree, and placed underneath a very heavy log, hence the name the house of the log. And using stone weights and pulleys connected to the log, they would be able to tighten that log and pull it down on top of the baskets and produce the freshest and most valuable olive oil, both for use within the community and, more than likely, we can assume, for trade between passersby and various other communities around the hills of Maresha. While in recent years the route of the Israel Ride hasn't brought us to the central city of Tel Aviv Jaffa here on the Mediterranean coast, nonetheless, I wanted to share a little bit with you about this very important place, especially given its role in the traditional Jewish Zionist narrative. While the port of Jaffa is an ancient city that has served communities all throughout history, we often reflect back on it in the Jewish tradition as the place where many of the pioneers landed when they first arrived on the shores of what was then Ottoman Palestine, the ancient land of Israel, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. A time when Jews were struggling around the world, primarily in Eastern Europe, because of anti-Semitism, because of all sorts of discrimination and persecution. There were inklings of an idea to perhaps redefine or reconstitute what Jewish community meant, perhaps in a wider, more national sense. And so to be able to imagine boatloads of Jews who were full of hope coming back to the historic land of the Bible in a sort of dream of rebuilding what might be the intention of Jewish identity, of Jewish future. And so landing here at the port of Jaffa, just outside the walls of the ancient city, they were able to come ashore and at the same time perhaps appreciate their unique ability to come back home in a certain sense, while also recognizing the many challenges that were awaiting in this very, very new and very different land from, of course, what their biblical references may have informed them. Some of them, of course, were going to move off to the major cities of Palestine at the time, whether it was Jerusalem or Hebron or maybe Tzfat, as a way of connecting to the ancient past of the Jewish people. Some of them were going to learn how to farm and go off into the rural communities and seek to build smaller versions of intentional community. And those would become the foundation of the kibbutz movement, while others actually recognized that Palestine of the 19th century, perhaps, was very much part of the Arab world and Arab culture, and chose to stay here in the city of Jaffa as a way of integrating into the economy and the culture that already existed at the time, as a way of finding their foothold in the Promised Land. And so with that, we see the various streams of Zionism that tend to originate here in the port of Jaffa, but go off and create the different sectors that together will eventually become the basis of the Zionistic movement that in 1948 declares statehood, the State of Israel. I'm guessing this is a view many of you might find a little familiar. We are standing on the high point of the old city of Jaffa, but we are looking north towards the very new city of Tel Aviv. And so going back to this romantic, perhaps Zionist narrative of arriving at the port of Jaffa, making one's decision which path you should take in order to plan your destiny in the land of Israel, many Jews decided to stay here in Jaffa in order to take advantage of the urban life within the Arab culture of Ottoman Palestine. However, part of the Jewish story was holding on to one's identity, holding on to one's values, and so a small group of Jews decided to break away from the center city of Jaffa and form a Jewish neighborhood on the outskirts, which we can see just in the distance past the low buildings before all of the high-rises. And they become the first neighborhoods of Jaffa, which over time will become so popular and relatively successful that 66 families decide they want to go big. And so they put their money into a pot, they acquire a piece of real estate just beyond the confines of the city of Jaffa, and where you see all of the high-rises of today, a little plot of land begins as early Tel Aviv. In the year 1909, the city was established and is going to grow to become what is today the largest metropolitan area in the entire state of Israel.